Dacia, stop talking. Come on. What is this? What do they say about educators? You're always breaking the rules, and passing notes in class. All right. Wow. So much to unpack. I've been trying to take notes because in the last panel, the good news is for the last panel, we don't have any papers to present, and we can get into a lot of these issues that have been raised throughout the day. We will definitely pick back up on that theme of social and emotional learning, and we will certainly talk about that in this panel too. Somebody out there, I won't tell you who, she said, it's so cute, the idea that the military is into social and emotional learning. Go blow that guy up, and okay, that's, anyways, I guess compared to some of the no excuses charter schools, you say that doesn't seem overly tough. If we can consider that social and emotional learning, then, flipping your t-shirt inside out doesn't seem so harsh. Okay. Again, I'm trying, I'm working. Thank you, Mitch, you're laughing. Tough crowd. All right, tough crowd. I hope you got your coffee. Hope you got your cookies. There's still coffee. There's no coffee. People get coffee. We need coffee. We have people from the West Coast here. They need coffee. Okay, this panel is now to take us all the way from age 0 to 13. We have talked already about what success looks like after the K-12 system. I have failed to convince anybody that kids can be okay with just a high school diploma if they follow the success sequence. Even Ron Haskins seemed to push back on that. Everybody seems to be very clear that yes, indeed, we need to get as many kids as possible into some kind of higher education. And in the high school panel, people agreed that that's hard, right? That for all of these kinds of pathways we're talking about, kids need high levels of skills. Right? If you want to go into a real college prep high school program, you need to know how to read. You need to know how to do math, right? And in fact, many of these charter schools that started at the high school level have discovered ninth grade's too late, so we're going to start a middle school, right? KIPP started at middle school. They decided that was too late. They started elementary schools, right? So the notion is we cannot get the job done if kids are coming into ninth grade way behind. If they cannot read, if they cannot do math, or let's say they're doing reading and math at a very low level. And of course, they also need other things like character skills, or if you want to call it non-cognitive skills, social and emotional learning skills. They need a lot. They need to come into ninth grade prepared for success, whatever this pathway is, whether we dramatically increase the number of apprenticeships, as Bob has argued today, which I think is a great idea, whether we dramatically increase the number of seats in high-quality career and technical programs and career academies, in this interesting idea of early college programs with a career focus. Any of those routes in high school require that kids come into ninth grade ready to hit the ground running with very high levels of reading and math skills. And yet, we know that for low-income kids, we are not getting the job done. And this panel is to talk about how we can do a dramatically better job of getting that job done. Because what we keep hearing again and again is if you don't get the job done now in, say, pre-K to 8, you don't have very many good options about how to get it done in high school. And if you don't get it done in high school, we've heard today that basically these kids are screwed. All right, so how do we get the job done 0 to 13? We're going to start with Elliot Regenstein, who is going to talk about preschool, but also pre-preschool. Elliot is the Senior Vice President at the Ounce of Prevention Fund, which is a really cool organization out of Chicago that both is a policy advocate on preschool issues, but also runs some incredibly high-performing preschools themselves. At Fordham, we respect organizations that try to do both the policy thing and the practice thing. We are then going to hear from my colleague, Robert Pondiscio, the Senior Fellow and Vice President for External Affairs. Did we really come up with that title? Is that what we could? That's the best we could come up with?
I'll take it.
I know. I'm just kidding. At the Fordham Institute, who is going to talk about really elementary schools, but elementary and middle schools, with a big focus on reading, making the case that literacy is hugely important. Certainly not the only thing that's important, but first among equals in terms of what the job we need to get done and what we need to do to get that job done that we're not doing today. And then finally, Tom Loveless, the Senior Fellow at the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution. If you see him run out of here, he has got to get to a Brown Center meeting, right, since Tom has not been back in D.C. in something like 5 months. And so this is good. They schedule meetings just around you now, Tom.
I think they do.
That was very nice. So he will be rushing out of here to his meeting. He's going to talk about the T word again, tracking, and make a provocative argument that actually, if we want to prepare more kids for academic success in high school, including in programs like advanced placement, what we need to do is be more comfortable with starting tracking in middle school and continuing that through high school, that is in fact what we continue to do in the affluent suburbs, where many of us send our kids to school, that tracking is still very much alive and well, that the high achieving kids in the suburbs still get the opportunity to be in class with other high achievers, and that we should allow low-income high achievers to have those same opportunities as well. So a lot of stuff, same rules here. We're going to have 8 minutes each. Then we're going to get to hear from Dacia, who is going to tell us about what she thinks of all of this from very much an on-the-ground perspective. She is the co-CEO and president at Achievement First. This is the charter school network that started with Amistad Academy in New Haven, Connecticut, and now has fantastic charter schools in a number of places in the Northeast, including in New York City. And I'm super excited to hear you weigh in on these issues, Dacia. And I might ask you about some of these other things we've been talking about today as well. So let's get started. Elliot Regenstein making the case for why starting at age 5 is way, way too late. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And I have to admit, as someone who works for an organization that does both early learning practice and policy, I feel a little bad. As many of you know, after lunch is a traditional nap time in early learning programs. So I am going to be talking about developmentally appropriate practice while trying to prevent you from engaging in developmentally appropriate napping. So I want to, there are some very hot debates about the research on early childhood and where some of the priorities have lied. But I want to start with some things that I think the research is pretty clear on and that hopefully we can all agree on. So first of all, we know that the first 5 years of life are very developmentally important. There's a lot of brain development that goes on in those years. Second of all, we know that adult behavior influences child development, right? Like what happens between kids and adults in those years actually matters, both positive and negative. We also know that there are things that work in those years, that there are ways in which adults can positively influence child development. We also know that there's a substantial achievement gap that's opened even before kids enter kindergarten. So especially with higher expectations for kindergarten in the Common Core era, low-income kids are often, who don't have access to great preschool, are in many instances entering kindergarten already behind, which means that the K-12 system is playing catch-up from the very first minute. So those are things that hopefully we can all agree on as we get into some of the more complex debates, and there are definitely some live ones. So one that breaks into the broader education conversation a fair bit. What programs work, right? Do existing programs work, and what would work if those ones don't? Another question is, who should the government be supporting to have early childhood experiences, right? They're unlike in K-12, where there's this effectively sort of universal access for people who want it, that doesn't exist in early childhood. And so the question of where should the next dollar go, which kids should be served? I want to start a little bit by talking about what works. And this won't be a huge surprise to those of you who focus on K-12 reform, but what works is great teaching, right? It's language rich. There's a lot of direct engagement between the teacher and children, a lot of looking kids in the eye and having a conversation with them. There are pre-math skills, pre-science skills built in. And it's also really focused on this broader development, including social and emotional skills. Some of that is grit and persistence, but some of that is just getting along with the other kids in the room, sharing, respect for others. It's hard to learn the content if you're not developing those skills as well. That's certainly something that Hugh Price was talking about, and there's actually a very good New America publication that just came out talking about how that works in early learning and applying some of those lessons to K-12. It's worth noting that in early learning standards are much broader. They're multi-domain, and so it's not just English, math, and science, but also things like approaches to learning, and that, again, the best pedagogy focuses on that whole range of developmental attributes. Another important aspect of the best pedagogy in early learning is assessment, frequent assessment. It's formative, but it's ongoing, and it's across these multiple domains. That provides an opportunity for teachers to not only tailor their practice, but also to communicate with parents about what's going on in the classroom and how parents can reinforce it. Teachers also work not only to communicate with parents, but to help facilitate communication among parents, and especially in programs serving low-income children, that some of the parents can you benefit from assistance in, working together and strategizing how to support their children's development. And there's some amount of two-generation work that goes on, helping parents find jobs, helping to improve the home environment, and to build on some of the conversation of the morning and the success sequence. One priority in a number of high-quality early learning programs is where you have teen moms with a first kid to create a greater space between that first kid and the second kid, which often gives those moms more opportunity to continue pursuing their education in that period. So, early learning is a point of entry not just for the kids, but for the parents. And I think, again, the best programs really approach it that way. So what I just described is the aspiration, and it is in fact a small slice of reality. It's much more likely that kids coming into kindergarten have had something that doesn't quite look like that, but that may have had, a good amount, sort of a good comfortable environment where the kids are well supported, but that, and safe, but that lacks some of the pedagogical elements and some of the teaching aspects of it. Of course, even that is aspirational for many kids, and there's a lot of kids who are coming in to kindergarten having had no experience in early learning whatsoever, or an experience that none of us would allow our children to have. We would take action quickly. So I talk about these different kinds of experiences and those kids then going on to enter kindergarten, but one important thing to think about is that when those kids enter kindergarten, in many instances, the schools actually have no idea what kind of experience those kids have. Think about the analogy with a high school and a middle school, or a middle school and an elementary school. The principals and the teachers in those receiving schools generally know at least where those kids were coming from. In early learning, that may be knowable, but it often isn't known. Attendance boundaries that serve K-12 schools don't generally apply to early childhood programs, and so the kids can be coming from a whole bunch of different places. Obviously, it's a little different with charter schools accepting them by lottery, but schools often don't even know where these kids come from. If they do know where they come from, the next step would be to have a shared definition of what does kindergarten readiness mean. A lot of the times it means one thing to a principal and a teacher in a K-12 school, and means something completely different to the early learning providers in the community. Standards are a critical part of creating those expectations, and kindergarten entry assessments can be another tool for creating shared expectations. But there's got to be some amount of communication between the elementary school and the providers in early learning. Collective professional development between early childhood teachers and K-2 teachers is one way to do it. Those teachers can then also support bridging activities for parents, but the fact is that often doesn't happen. The early childhood community is often dispersed. It's a lot of smaller providers without much capacity, and a lot of schools don't devote much time and energy to reaching out to them. Part of the problem is that, honestly, K-12 leaders don't have much incentive to focus on these early years. The average superintendent lasts 3 or 4 years on the job. The major metrics of success for that superintendent are their test scores in 3rd grade and up. The kids who are 4 years old in a superintendent's first year won't take accountability tests until the 5th year of a superintendent's term. So why should the superintendent focus on those 4-year-olds when most superintendents don't really know anything about child development in those years? When the early learning community is fragmented and often very difficult to deal with, and the superintendent probably doesn't have a lot of relationships there. When the superintendent doesn't think of themselves as having a lot of new money to start a new program, and when the superintendent doesn't think they're going to be around to reap the benefits of whatever program is started. Layer onto that the fact that in high mobility communities, which is a lot of what we're talking about today, superintendents often assume that the kids who are 4 years old in those communities will probably move somewhere else before 3rd grade anyway, and there's a fair amount of data suggesting that they're not crazy to think that. And I should add, by the way, that superintendents, when they do think about early learning, tend to think about 4-year-olds because that's what's most familiar to them. But in fact, by the time the kids turn 4, a huge percentage of the achievement gap has already opened. The best chance to have an impact on kids is actually in those 0 to 3 years, followed by 2 years of preschool at ages 3 and 4. And again, the way to have impact is to do those years well and provide great teaching. So we've actually called for greater accountability for quality in those pre-3rd grade years, both in early learning and K-2, because honestly, we don't see quality instruction being adequately valued in those years under the current system. Accountability in those years can't really be based on standardized tests because that's not developmentally appropriate. But one trend we are excited about in early learning is seeing providers rated on the quality of their instruction rather than on sort of input metrics the way things have been done in the past. So, right now, To sum up, we're not really demanding enough in early learning. Programs aren't held to high enough standards of pedagogy. We're not measuring the quality of pedagogy nearly enough. We're not paying teachers nearly enough to attract teachers capable of doing great pedagogy. And the program level leadership and essential systems to support teachers capable of great pedagogy simply aren't there. All of those are relatively fundamental problems that are going to need to be dealt with if we're going to prevent the achievement gap from opening before kindergarten. Stronger accountability in the early years would be a sign that we're serious about addressing some of these issues. So education for upward mobility has to start at birth. That developmentally, the research tells us that. Let's take advantage of this period we know is developmentally important and actually commit to providing a great education to kids who need it most.
A great example of following my instructions on the time limit. I love it, Elliot. It's a very good. Those preschoolers tend to be pretty obedient, so that's, yes. I think this is what happened now. Just to say that, thank you all so much. I want to ask you, and we'll do that in the panel. Now, Robert's argument, I believe, is absolutely preschool is great. Better preschool is even better. But it's not enough, and that we're not taking advantage of any gains we're getting from preschool in most of our elementary schools today. Take it away, Robert.
8 minutes. Good news is I talk really, really fast. Look, it would be naive to suggest that there's one best way to educate all children of low-income Americans to put them on the path for upward mobility. But if you were to choose one outcome and one outcome only that schools are likely to be able to influence, and that's a key distinction, then I would like to suggest that we choose doing everything we can to ensure that children develop a large vocabulary. Vocabulary size is a pretty good proxy for a whole range. We can take that down. We're not going to get to that for a while. But less than 8 minutes. Vocabulary is a good proxy for a whole range of educational attainments and abilities. It signals competence in reading and writing. It correlates with SAT success, which predicts the likelihood of college attendance and graduation, and all of those good things with wage premiums and whatnot. Vocabulary also seems to predict more than success in just college. It was interesting to listen to Hugh Price speaking about the military, and I was curious, so I Googled while he was speaking, and it turns out, well, I'm curious if anybody knows, what is the median reading level of a recruit in the military as of 1986, 30 years ago, which was the most recent data I could find. Anybody? Yeah, very good. I expected it to be lower. It was 9.5. These are folks who are running B-1 bombers and aircraft carriers and nuclear reactors. You need a high level of literacy for that.
Sorry, that's on the enlisted side.
Correct. Look, Edie Hirsch recently pointed out as well in an article in City Journal that the AFQT, the Armed Forces Qualification Test, predicts real-world job performance most accurately when you double the verbal score of that test and add it to the math score. He also noted that much of the disparity in the black-white income gap disappears when you take AFQT scores, again, weighted towards the verbal side, into account. So in short, those old Reader's Digest quizzes, if you're as old as I am, were exactly right. It really does pay to increase your word power. So there are no magic bullets, but if your goal is to raise income level, to prime the pump for upward mobility, the place to start appears to be in the language arts classroom in elementary school and in middle school. But that's harder than it sounds, obviously. The challenge, as Elliot pointed out, starts not in school, but before then. No mystery here, right? Children who grow up in low-income homes tend to come to schools with smaller vocabularies than their more affluent peers. Those children, I like to say, grew up in a rich verbal stew, the affluent children. They live, as my friend Mike Goldstein likes to say, he talks about parents narrating the broccoli as they go through the grocery store. They live in a state of constant annotation. These are relative advantages and disadvantages in the first years of life that establish a verbal trajectory that is deeply difficult to change. It's even harder, however, when we don't address it directly. The term the Matthew effect, which I trust a lot of you are familiar with, has been used to describe what happens when some kids come to school with smaller vocabularies and less general knowledge. It basically translates into the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. But why is this so? Well, let's consider for a second how we learn new words. It's not by studying vocabulary. A typical college freshman has a working vocabulary of approximately 60,000 words. Let's do the math on that. To learn that many words by age 18, you would have to learn 10 words a day, 70 words a week, 3,300 words per year. And that, by the way, is assuming you learn your first 10 words in the delivery room. Clearly, this is not how we develop vocabulary. So where does that rich, robust vocabulary that most of us have come from? Well, here's an example that I stole from my former colleague at the Core Knowledge Foundation, Alice Wiggins. This explains that mysterious word that popped up this morning that you didn't understand. I love this example because it's a word that's obscure. We can all read it, but probably very few people know what it means. It's the word excrescence. Anybody know what this means? Don't blurt it out, but does anybody know? Nobody ever knows this word. One person. Bravo. You've heard me give this talk before. So let me give it to you in a sentence, if you would. Next slide. Or do I have? Maybe I do this. There we go. To calculate fuel efficiency, the aerospace engineers needed an accurate estimation of excrescence drag caused by the shape of the plane's cabin. Now you all know what this word means, right? No? All right. Well, I'll give you another example. Excrescences on the valves of the heart have been known to cause a stroke. I just see one or two people nodding, like, okay, I think I got this now. Let me give you another one so you can further refine your definition. The wart, a small excrescence on his skin, had made Jeremy self-conscious for years. Now I'm seeing several nodding heads, and if I give you one more sentence, you can confirm your definition. At the far end of the meadow was what at first glance I thought was a huge dome building, and then I saw was an excrescence from the cliff itself. So you probably figured out, if you didn't already know, one person already knew, that an excrescence is a projection or outgrowth, especially something that's out normal. See, this is an accelerated example of how word learning actually occurs. The general sense of the word that you read gets narrowed down over time with repeated exposures until eventually it becomes part of your working vocabulary. But here's the part that I'll bet you overlooked. Think of all the words and the knowledge that you already had that enabled you to learn this new word. You knew, I assume, about engineers and strokes and warts. You didn't have to stop and wonder what the terms fuel efficiency and aerospace and self-conscious meant. You were already rich in knowledge and vocabulary, and you just got a little richer. If you did not know those things, you just fell a little bit further behind. That's the Matthew effect. This gets to the heart of our struggle to improve reading comprehension, grow verbal ability, especially for children who come from low-income homes, from language-poor homes. The heck with the labor participation rate, I would argue. Literacy drives the functional adulthood participation rate. You can see this example. I'll cut this short in the interest of time. I was going to talk about Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary words, but the sweet spot for education, for growing vocabulary for our students K through 8 is so-called Tier 2 words. They're not simple words like run or baby or technical terms like isotope or exposition. They're those rich words in the middle. A word like durable. So where would, just like in the excrescence example, where would a child encounter this Tier 2 word, durable? Well, maybe in sentences like these that I actually culled from children's books and websites. The same principle applies here, right? If you don't know who the Egyptians are, what papyrus is, who the Romans were, what concrete is, what it means to look for a long-lasting dwelling, or what a makeshift shelter is, then this all sounds like the Charlie Brown teacher to you, right? It's all mwah, 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 and durable is just one more word that you don't understand. So seen through this lens, it's immediately and abundantly clear that the key to language growth is the broadest possible knowledge base. I will not belabor the point here, but one of the reasons that reading growth has stalled in our schools, broadly speaking, for several decades, is because the tendency has been in too many ELA classrooms to disregard this, to treat ELA, English Language Arts, as either content-free or to be content agnostic in teaching children to read. after they learn the basics of decoding and fluency and whatnot. The general thought seems to be that as long as kids are reading, it doesn't really much matter what they're reading. Now, to be sure, all reading is of some value. Even simple texts have more rare and unique words than even the speech of college graduates. But again, as these demonstrations show, if you have a rich vocabulary, it's not because you memorize a lot of words, it's because you have sufficiently broad knowledge that allows you to contextualize and read. Those are the fertile conditions that allow language proficiency to flower and grow. So just to sum up, look, I'm very encouraged by this conference. This is a hugely important topic. The question that it asks, how do we help our poorest children achieve escape velocity from poverty, is precisely the question that we should be asking. But I will confess to a bit of trepidation. It would be the easiest thing in the world to further devalue mere academics, content, as it were. We do this in the service of vocational skills, non-cognitive skills, 21st century skills, what have you. It'd be very easy to follow all of these ideas off a cliff. But I would argue that quite the opposite is what we need to do. Academic content is language proficiency. Language proficiency is competence. Competence is upward mobility. If we don't get that right, then nothing else will matter. So my challenge to all of us would be, let's not make this the theme of today one more thing that lets K-12 off the hook. The job for K-12 will get richer, more important, not less important. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And the mystery of the strange word has been solved. Yes. All right, finally, Tom Loveless. And we're going to talk about tracking, and I think maybe you can start, Tom, by explaining the kind of tracking you're talking about, because we've been talking about tracking at high school as in the career track versus the college prep track. You're talking about middle school, and you're talking about something very different. So come on up.
I don't take directions well, so I probably won't do any of that, but and my second slide will do that, and it is filled with text. No, I was told not to use any text, but sorry, that's the way it goes. Where is my thing?
He's getting
not
ready.
quite there. I can start, though, by saying in the 1980s, an anti-tracking movement began in the United States, and it was very effective. And that's odd in education policy. Since when is any movement effective, right? It actually succeeded in driving tracking out of most middle schools, and especially schools that serve Black, Hispanic, and poor kids. And my basic argument today is that's a problem for high-achieving kids who happen to be Black, Hispanic, or poor. Because the one thing probably that we know about tracking is that it can be an effective intervention for the education of high-achieving kids. If you take a look at kids who take AP in 12th grade, they've been in a pipeline since 7th grade. They've been taking advanced math all the way through. So heterogeneously grouping kids might be ill-serving the very population it's intended to help. So that's why I have the question mark. Could it be a surprising ally in the pursuit of equity? There are three propositions to my argument. The first I just mentioned, poor Hispanic and Black kids are underrepresented in tracked classes. If you want to find tracked classes, you're going to find that they're more often populated in tracked schools, that's proposition number two, in communities that have large percentages of white, Asian, or upper income or middle income students. So kids in poor communities do not get tracked classes. The third proposition is that research on tracking is mixed, but studies generally show a positive effect for high achievers. So something that could be helping high achieving children from disadvantaged backgrounds is not being provided to them. What is tracking? I finally got to Mike's question, and I'm going to answer it with text. First of all, students are assigned to separate classes based on achievement. It's not the old style tracking vocational programs kids are where we decide when they're 5 years old what they're going to be when they're 35. What we simply mean by tracking today is that we assign kids to separate classes, and I'm going to focus in particular on mathematics. The second bullet shows a typical middle school would offer 3 forms of math to 8th graders: Algebra 1, Pre-Algebra, or 8th grade math, 3 different tracks. Most middle schools today in the United States, over half, only offer now 2 tracks, an Algebra 1 class, and then another class called 8th grade math to everybody else. And then in English language arts, there would be honors English and then 8th grade English. The alternative to tracking, so the counter proposition to tracking, is to have heterogeneously grouped classes. They're also called detracked or untracked classes, where you have mixed ability kids all receiving a standard curriculum, and it's then incumbent upon the teacher to differentiate within that classroom. Let's look at some data. Here's the latest data from NAEP. It shows you the last several administrations of NAEP. On the left-hand side of the table shows you the percentage of kids in high-poverty schools who are in heterogeneous classes for mathematics in 8th grade. And if you go down to 2005 at the bottom, you can see it was 43%. Clear to the right side of the table are low-poverty schools. These are advantaged, suburban, typically white neighborhoods. Only 17% of 8th graders were in heterogeneous math classes in 8th grade. 2 things I'd point out. Notice the ratio all the way through the graph, and the laser pointer isn't working, so I'll just describe it. But if you go up that column in the first column, you'll see that in those high poverty schools, detracking has been diminishing. So tracking is making somewhat of a comeback. The stigma that was assigned to tracking in the 1980s and 90s is beginning to fade somewhat. I think there's been pushback maybe by parents and teachers. And now in high poverty schools, we're seeing more tracking and less of this heterogeneous grouping. If you look on the clear to the right side again in those wealthier schools, that's been very stable. Heterogeneous classes just are not very popular in middle and upper income neighborhoods. Here's some research that we have on tracking. These are the 2 classic meta-analyses that have been conducted, one by Kulik and Kulik, University of Michigan, the other one by Robert Slavin. They're getting a little long in the tooth. They were both published in 1992, although the research that's been published since then basically reaffirms these findings. If you take a look at Kulik, clear to the right, the findings are that tracking has no effect. That 0.03 effect size under Kulik is simply no effect. Under Slavin, it's 0.00, which really is no effect. And then if you decompose those findings into high, middle, and low students, you see a slight tendency for high students to benefit, but nothing special. Kulik went on, if you look at the next 2 rows, to examine 2 special kinds of grouping for high-achieving kids. In the middle row, enriched, gifted, and talented. These are programs that essentially offer a grade-level curriculum, but then jack up the cognitive difficulty of the curriculum. Okay, so you don't accelerate on into higher-level curriculum. You have basically your grade-level curriculum with some enrichment. The bottom row looks at accelerated, gifted, and talented programs, and you get a very big effect size there, 0.81. Now, I don't take this, 0.87. I don't take this research, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because there are selection problems with all evaluations of programs like gifted programs, like tracking, where you wonder about how well the controls were for selecting on kids' initial ability before they went into the program. These are bright kids. They're going to do very well, so take that with a grain of salt. But nevertheless, the evidence suggests that tracking helps high-achieving kids to achieve. Here are the 10 experiments that have been done going back to into the 1920s. Again, this is where kids were randomly assigned to either a tracked or a detracked situation, and the effect size is down at the bottom, it's 0. So basically, overall, no effect in terms of tracking, but if anybody benefits, it's going to be the high kids. And by the way, if the high kids are benefiting and the overall effect is 0, somebody's probably paying, and that's going to be low achievers. If there's any problem with tracking, it's in low tracks. Now, in the 90s, as I said, schools began on tracking, and the first paper that came out, and this is an excellent paper, it's based on NELS data, which is longitudinal data looking at students as they progress from 8th to 10th grade. These are 3 economists, Argus, Rees, and Brewer. And the title of the paper exactly states it right. It's Detracking America's Schools, Equity at Zero Cost, with a question mark. And they concluded that Okay, we can get equity, but here's how we get equity. On the left-hand side, you see the light blue bar. Those are high-achieving kids, and this is how much they gain from being in a track situation. They gain about 6 percentage points. By the way, if you want to know the effect of heterogeneous grouping, just flip this over. So they lose 6% if they're in a heterogeneous class. The gain in the middle two quartiles, average performing students, they lose also. They lose 2%. They gain 2% being in a track situation. They would lose that 2% if they were in a heterogeneous situation. And then finally, the black bar, those are the kids below grade level, and because of tracking, they can lose achievement. So there are costs either way, and you can see that essentially, if you were to adopt heterogeneous grouping, you wind up redistributing learning in a certain sense. The high achievers pay a certain price, the two middle quartiles pay a certain price, low achievers may gain, and the opposite if you revert back to tracking. One of the problems of those low tracks and of heterogeneous tracks is that teachers find heterogeneous tracks, and I think this may be what's going on now as we move away from tracking, they find them very difficult to teach. These are two polls of teachers conducted within 10 years this is the MetLife survey of teachers. So in 1998 and 2008, teachers were asked, and take a look at the prompt. I mean, the prompt is very dramatic, so I'm kind of surprised that teachers would respond as forcefully as they do. My classes have become so mixed in terms of students' learning abilities that I can't teach them effectively. So that's really not asking them, gee, do you kind of like tracking? I mean, that's a pretty blunt prompt. And 39% of the teachers in 1998 either agreed strongly or agreed somewhat, and that number has gone up. In the last poll in 2008, it was 43%. So teachers do find it difficult to teach heterogeneous classes. Any of you who have taught, an 8th grade classroom can have reading ability anywhere from 2nd grade to 12th grade, graduating from high school. So it's very difficult to teach Moby Dick at the same time you're teaching decoding skills. It's just very hard. Now here are some recent studies. I'll just summarize this one for you. Two economists, Card and Giuliano. How much time?
You're actually over.
Okay. Card and Giuliano did a study in an eastern school district where tracks were created in low-income neighborhoods, and they found a huge effect, and especially with economically disadvantaged kids. And they urged that all schools offer some kind of separate class for high-achieving students. Figlio and Page did a study in Florida. They found very much the same thing. They said they found no evidence that detracking America's schools will improve outcomes among disadvantaged students, and they said that we might even be harming the very students that we're intending to help. So what I propose, and I'll just spend 1 minute on this, and that is, with the Common Core, with the advent of the Common Core lays out a high school mathematics program of 3 years, and it has two pathways, either integrated math or Algebra 1, followed by geometry, followed by Algebra 2. And what I suggest is we take, and this is, by the way, suggested by the authors of Common Core in Appendix A, take the 7th and 8th grade curriculum and also the Algebra 1 curriculum, compact it into 2 years. So take 3 years of curriculum, compact it into 2 years. Let's insist that every low-income school provide its high-achieving kids the ability to accelerate through the curriculum. Because I'm telling you, once the Common Core gets implemented in the suburbs, moms and dads and teachers are going to be demanding that there's acceleration. And let's not leave kids from disadvantaged backgrounds behind with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've been prompted without an introduction, but it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So I'm Dacia. I run the Achievement First network of charter schools, which is now 29 schools from Rhode Island to New York. And I get to bring the practitioner perspective. And on my way here, I was thinking, I'm a little bit of a fish out of water in the sense that I spend all day, every day, thinking very, very practically about how to address all these issues. And I was surprised on some level that I'd said, yes, I would love to engage and read all these papers and respond. And the real truth is I found them very provocative and very helpful. And for the most part, wish I had read them years ago. Because they are... in a way that's extremely relevant, I think, tracking some of the very painful lessons that we are learning on the ground. So first, to start with pre-K. After 15 years of doing this work, we'll be opening our first pre-K in the fall. And I think that is finally an acknowledgement that as much as we believe the work we're doing can have a huge impact on kids, it seems borderline crazy not to want to start earlier. In a high-quality way, frankly, for many of the reasons that not just Elliot, but also Tom emphasized, and Robert. And so on some level, that's true. And yet I found myself in the whole discussion, and I've had this ambivalence about pre-K. You think, who could be against high-quality pre-K? And now that I'm a mother, I feel it even more. And I think the tension I know we all feel is how can we simultaneously honor that that this is a complex problem, that we have to attack it on all fronts, that what we want for children, for our own children, for all children is incredibly ambitious, and that we want to do all these things, and yet acknowledge that every year of a child's life matters. Every school can have a huge impact. Every teacher can have a huge impact. And I just find myself personally going back and forth between wanting to acknowledge complexity and yet wanting to own results. Because in my experience, it really is the case that individual teachers and individual schools can have a profound impact on the trajectory of a child's life. So on pre-K, I really appreciated the way Elliot, I think, makes the case in very compelling terms that this is an investment we want to make. And my read of the politics is that we are going to have more and more pre-K. I see, even in a situation of constrained resources, a lot of states making the decision to do that, in part based on the mounting evidence. I think the real question I am left wondering is, how can we make sure it's high quality? And I have some healthy skepticism, if not something more negative, in the presumption that we would just expand school, and that the very K-12 system that is currently failing so many kids, we can count on to deliver high quality pre-K. That doesn't seem to me like a smart bet to make. And so the question I would love for policymakers and philanthropists to struggle with is, how do we create a system that's really going to deliver quality at much higher rates, frankly, than the current K-12 system is delivering quality. And I don't know, for those states that have not yet taken the plunge or not taken the full plunge, I do wonder if it's a bit of a New Orleans moment, in the sense that we actually do not yet have a broken system. And there is an opportunity to start in a fresh way and approach these questions of quality in a fresh way and try to set up a system that from the beginning, and whether that is the New Orleans answer with multiple providers and choice and competition, or whether that is an answer that embraces diversity and says if you mix up the power dynamics, you're more likely to get a high quality outcome by serving students, including those from very well-resourced families who are very sophisticated these questions, or you go about it from the traditional accountability and evaluation perspective. I think we need to make a big bet about what's going to deliver quality and then pay attention to that, because I think this train is leaving the station. So then, to turn to Robert's paper, I feel like it may seem a little esoteric to talk about background knowledge and vocabulary. I have become religious on these questions. And it really is, we have the benefit of operating schools in New York that have experienced the Common Core 2 years ahead of the rest of the country. And it is a hell of a wake-up call. And the achievement gap is even wider than we thought it was. Our schools, which were high achieving under the old regime, are no longer. And it has really sent us back to the drawing board to really say, what do we need to do for kids and how can we close these gaps? And the more you look at the English language arts gaps in particular, the more you come back to background knowledge and vocabulary. I do believe you can teach kids to closely read a text, but that is the third tier to the first two. And as text becomes more sophisticated, as it becomes more nonfiction, as it becomes more like what they see in college and career and everyday life, these gaps get more and more exposed. And as I reflect on one of the bigger mistakes, sadly not the only one, but one of the bigger mistakes I made as a practitioner when we first started is we thought, well, the kids are struggling in reading. So what do? You have more reading. And we literally cut back on history and science classes, in particular in elementary schools. We had the sense to keep PE and music, but we really did shortchange those subjects, and I realized that was exactly the wrong thing to have done. That in fact, really rich, hands-on science and sophisticated history and reading in both history and science is profoundly impactful in terms of equipping our kids to be successful. And for those of you who've had the pleasure of reading Robert's paper, he goes very directly, in a way I admire, at issues of culture and diversity. And if we are talking about core knowledge, small core knowledge, CK, how do we decide whose knowledge is core and what we should be teaching kids? And I just think there's room there to expand everyone's horizon. And if we took a broader definition of what we want to see, there are ways in which we could push kids from the quote-unquote dominant culture to become more versed in African American and Hispanic cultures and vice versa. And I really do believe that body of knowledge and, of course, the vocabulary I thought he spoke to would make a big difference. And we've been at this now for 2 years, and I think it's the only thing that's moving the needle, and it moves really slowly. But I think it's really worth it. Tom's paper was definitely the one I had the hardest time with. I found it deeply challenging around these questions of tracking and what makes the most sense. When we first started out 15 years ago, at least in some subjects, in some grades, we did go with this kind of skill-based grouping in the logic that if you give kids instruction at their level, that's when they're most likely to succeed. And about 6 years ago, and accelerating, we've actually moved away from that for 5 big reasons. The first is, as you can imagine, when you have the kids who struggle the most together, there are certain sort of peer and sometimes behavior dynamics, and we always put our strongest teachers with those kids as part of our belief system, but it was nevertheless an effect that was very real. Second, I would say, is the realizations we've had about the importance of content and vocabulary. And I think we've all now learned, at least on the ELA side, that the leveled reader is a real problem. And that if kids are never exposed to more sophisticated vocabulary, sentence structure, content, they will never catch up. I mean, you are really condemning them, frankly, to this profound literacy gap. Second is, I think, and this is where the Common Core in math has probably helped us most, which is there's certain pedagogies and pedagogical approaches that get tried with gifted kids that we have not tried in more direct instruction style with lower achieving kids. And those two turn out to be handicaps and hobbling of students, at least in our experience. And the more we've shifted to pushing all kids to do more authentic grappling with complex problems, the more they have all achieved. Third, even in an atmosphere where we openly screen teacher for mindsets, and we are very, very clear you can't get through the door if you don't have high expectations for all kids. Nevertheless, when we looked at our kind of skill-based groups, there were expectations differences across those teachers that felt like they were reinforcing, not liberating, of students. And then, I'm not sure if Howard Fuller is still here, but Howard Fuller has schooled me in power and what power means. And I do have fundamental concerns about tracking that would result in the folks with disproportionate power in the system getting their high achieving classes and those without not, and lived that in my own student teaching experience almost 20 years ago. I would say, though, what I find very provocative as somebody who is personally trying every day to help low-income kids and first-gen kids pass AP tests, is that I think there are some versions of this that that I would encourage us all to embrace. And there are two forms of quote unquote tracking that we are doubling down on. The first is what came up in Tom's paper, but he didn't address today, which is the notion of double dosing for some kids. So even if you say everybody's going to get an AP curriculum, there may be a version where some kids take 18 months to do that AP curriculum and some kids do it in 12 months. Or in our case, we're having some AP classes just to be 18-month classes for all kids. We also double dose in take middle school math, where you have 20% of the kids who in essence have a second math class every day. And they are pre-taught the material before they then go into a setting where everybody else is engaged with the material, so that they're entering that class already ahead. And then we just done a redesign of our entire model. And I think inspired in part by blended learning and digital learning. I think when you really embrace some of those competency-based and mastery-based learning versus the standard seat time, or personalized and individualized instruction versus everybody gets the same, it's hard not to de facto go in a direction where if kids are if they're really able to race ahead at their own level, you're going to have spread and you're going to have some kids racing further than others. And we've tried to, and this is still very new for us, but sort of split the difference, where kids have computer-based instruction that's at their level. They even have some small group work that's at their level, but that the core problem-solving, application-oriented math class is still heterogeneous because everybody benefits from hearing the thinking of other students. So whether those practical ideas from the field help to resolve some of these tensions, I think they're real, and I would like to thank all these folks for pushing my thinking and all of our thinking.
Wow, great stuff. I could listen to these folks all day long. No chance of falling asleep after lunchtime here. Let's get right into a bunch of these questions. Dacia raised this question, Elliot, about how do we make sure this is actually high quality. We see right now New York City building out additional spots for pre-K. Dacia's optimistic we're going to see more of this in other places. You know, it's interesting. I was having an opposite reaction to Elliot's paper, which was, hey, I'm convinced we need to do more in pre-K, but, you know, I don't see the political will. You've got half the states are under complete Republican control right now. Are we really going to see, you know, people saying, yes, let's spend more money on preschool? Maybe not. Let's assume that that does happen in some places, that there are places that say, okay, we're going to make a greater investment. But it's never going to be enough to do all of the things on your list, Elliot. The 0 to 3, the high quality for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, paying these instructors as much as we pay K-12 teachers. I mean, all of that wish list, I mean, let's just assume for a moment that has a super high price tag, especially if we want to serve all the kids. So you have a limited amount of new public money. How do you target it? What's the most important thing for us to be doing in this area?
Sure. So first, is this on? Yeah, okay, good. So first of all, I would point out, not to inject facts into politics, but that a year ago, the 3 states that had the largest increase in early learning spending were all states with Republican governors and completely Republican-controlled legislatures.
Interesting.
So this is an issue where, and you know, some of those states are doing a better job than others, but that this is actually an issue where, at least at the state level, there are champions on both sides of the aisle. To answer your question directly, though, I would say that in terms of having an impact, I would start as early as possible. I would invest in the quality, and I would focus on the kids who are most at risk, right? If we're talking about education for upward mobility, I'm for universal preschool in the same way that I'm for universal 8th grade, but in terms of having an impact on kids who are likely to end up on the wrong side of the divide, the impact is going to come from focusing on those kids who need it most and actually doing it right? There's such a huge tendency in government programs to split the difference between doing it right and not doing it at all, and in essence sort of doing it halfway, and that then you end up spending a lot of money without having the intended impact. That, you know, in terms of what it's going to take, it is expensive particularly to serve infants and toddlers, because you can't have, you know, I went to law school, like we had classes where there was one professor for 80 teachers. You can't do that for infants and toddlers. I dare you to try. But the
Sal Khan, I'm sure, is trying that right now.
Right.
There.
So you know, but in terms of if we're talking about really making a difference for kids, that is what's going to do it, and that requires both the upfront investment to have a well-designed and well-executed program, and then watching it to make sure it happens, right? I mean, again, you can argue with the particular metrics that No Child Left Behind chose, but the basic notion that it is not okay for schools to drift along aimlessly without anybody really paying attention to what they're doing, that was something that No Child Left Behind had right, that no one is I don't think anyone in this room would want to give that back, and that we have to apply that in the early learning context as well.
Is Head Start part of the problem?
Head Start is a potential part of the solution. I would say that it's not all the way there yet. That, Head Start, and you look at some of the research on Head Start, particularly the impact study from, the programs of 10 years ago, Head Start essentially did what it was designed to do, which was provide broad spectrum treatment to low-income kids, but I would argue without the pedagogical focus that's necessary to see real educational achievement impacts. It's been moving in the right direction. I think we'd like to see it move there even faster. But that is, the largest program for kids right now. And I think we would say that it's not where it needs to be, but that it is the right base to start from.
Right. I mean, to Dacia's point, we do have a system in pre-K, right? The biggest part of that system in most places is Head Start. So it's not like we have a ability to start fresh completely. There's certainly, if we're adding new programs at the state level or local level, we can. Robert, let me push you on a few things. Obviously, I am sold on the importance of content knowledge and vocabulary, as we have been at Fordham for a long time. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But when you were making the case that reading is the most important thing, I think I saw Jason Zimba out there crying a little bit about math not getting the attention that it needs. We heard in these other panels, we kept hearing about math and science, science. We need, especially for these career and technical pathways, the welder needs to know math and science.
What language is instruction in those subjects in?
Mathematics? No. Yeah.
Really? Okay. Well, if you
Arabic?
see a workaround for functional vocabulary, I'd like to hear it. But it's the gateway subject. And actually, I take it back. It always irks me when other people call reading a subject. It's not a subject. It's a skill. Subject for another time. It's not a skill in the way that riding a bike is a skill, but it is the way you access all areas of content. I just want to say, by the way, that I'm just giddy sitting here listening to Dacia talk about how she gets this. And this was, I take your point that it was a mistake, but I've been waiting for years to hear the head of a CMO say what you just said, which is that they understand that this is what kids need. I like you, I work with low-income kids when I'm not at Fordham, and this was the epiphany that I had teaching in the South Bronx some years ago. But yeah, this is the what you are saying is what I've been waiting for somebody to say for about 10 years now. So thank you.
Yes, and let the record show that she did give some credit to Common Core for calling this out and for making this clear. So let's talk about that. You talk about getting religion on the idea of content knowledge. Edie Hirsch has been in the wilderness for 30 years making this case, and yet I think it's fair to say in most elementary schools in this country, high poverty elementary schools, we've done a better job now teaching phonics, right? But then we go into teaching, quote, comprehension skills. We used level readers, which you say are part of the problem. A lot of other schools have stripped out the history and the science, just like you did, and said, well, that's something we'll get to later. How do we get other elementary schools to get religion on this? It seems like a great message. Hey, bring content back into the elementary school curriculum. Why are we having such a hard time making that case? Dacia first, and then Robert. Yes. Isn't there a trick you're not supposed to call on the first kid that raises his hand? Didn't I read that in Doug Lemov's book?
He's cold calling.
Okay, yeah.
I really do think Common Core is going to expose this. We had very high reading scores under the way we were doing it, and frankly, there was a way to, I don't want to call it test prep, but to provide a very superficial level when you're reading texts that are kind of not worth reading, frankly, and using that as your assessment. It just creates a false positive. That's not the text that our kids were encountering in college or in their careers, or even at sort of most newspaper levels at a sort of sophisticated. And so they were doing well by a low-level assessment. And as much as I hate to admit it, I think even the bigger cardinal sin that we committed, other than not properly valuing content and vocabulary, was we said we were about helping our kids graduate from college and be successful in life, but the truth is the annual state test became the de facto measure. And as long as that annual state test was a low-level test, sure, you could hopefully inspire yourself and others to shoot above it, but it became the kind of validator one way or another, and it was hard to know how successful you were in shooting above it without more sophisticated assessments. I think the Common Core has freed us from that, so we now have much more rigorous assessments, and it's exposing this, and part of what set us on this journey is there aren't many of them, but there are a handful of outliers in New York who on the English language arts tests are having suburban level kind of gap closing performance serving low income students. And what they have in common is that they have valued content more than the rest of us. In some cases, they are actually core knowledge schools, like the Icon schools. The Success Academy schools are another great example. And they have been prioritizing hands-on science for kids and deep science knowledge 5 days a week from kindergarten for years. And so then when the kids were exposed to rigorous science texts, they knew what they were talking about.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Just a quick note, if I could. There's a significant challenge here for policymakers that has to be addressed. You heard Dacia say earlier that this moves very, very slowly, right? And that is true. This is a challenge for policymakers and reform orthodoxy, frankly, because as long as we're beholden to annual reading tests, there is no active incentive to make the long-term investments in knowledge and vocabulary because most reading tests as currently configured simply do not reward them.
Okay. Now, let me give Tom a chance to respond to some of Dacia's concerns on the tracking point. I'm curious what you would have to say to the point she made about why they went backwards on detracking.
Well, I think we just see it differently as far as what's inequitable. I mean, I see the current situation as completely inequitable for high-achieving children from poor families. The high-achieving kids in wealthier neighborhoods are being served. They're being served with gifted programs. They're being served with special opportunities for math classes in 8th grade. 5% of American kids take algebra in 7th grade. Forget about 8th grade. 40% take it in 8th grade. In California, that number is even much higher. Those kids tend to be in suburbs. Now, that's inequity to me. So we're not going into schools that serve low-income kids and insisting, look, you have some high achievers here, and you need to serve them. And to me, that's inequitable, and if we throw it back on parents, the only people who can fix that situation are parents. So the parents who bring in SWAT teams of tutors and summer camps, solving equations, those are not poor parents. They can't afford it. So to me, that's an inequitable situation, and it's very easily fixed. The Common Core gives us an opportunity. The compacting policy that I recommended, what it means is every junior high, every middle school is going to offer 2 math classes. One that's accelerated and compacted, and you know what the low group gets? In other words, everybody else? They get the Common Core. The 8th graders get Common Core 8th grade math, so that's not low expectations. If you believe in the Common Core, everybody else gets the Common Core. But there will be kids for whom the Common Core won't move fast enough, and the authors of Common Core have said this. Schools are going to have to come up with solutions for this. Here's a solution that they said, here's something you might want to try. I think they should try it. I think suburban districts will be trying it. I think suburban districts will be trying it on steroids. I think you're going to see even 3 years compacted maybe in 7th grade. And where it won't happen is in low-income neighborhoods and low-income schools, and I think that's an injustice.
Can I just get you on the record, Tom? Did you just imply that Common Core represents high expectations?
No.
Never behave, Tom. Never.
But I don't think it represents low expectations either. It's just that's not my point. I'm not here to evaluate the expectations.
I know. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help. All right. Common Core. Okay.
Can I add one more thing? The importance of this has to do with who takes AP calculus in 12th grade. So these kids who are accelerated up through, if they complete Algebra 2 as 10th graders, they can take pre-calc in 11th grade and they're very well prepared for AP calculus. The other kids are not going to be as well prepared. They might be prepared, but not as well prepared, and it'll be the really top math students who come out of just the sequence that's offered.
All right, let me ask Dacia to weigh in. We've been hearing a lot today about social and emotional learning, or, I mean, all these different flavors. I mean, and everybody has different ideas of what these mean. But, okay, that piece, or character education, or performance character, or non-cognitive skills. The Paul Tough argument that, you know, we've been so focused on academic skills, there's all these other things that matter too. This gets into behavioral issues at school. Some people complain that no excuses charters are too tough, discipline-wise. Unpack some of this for us. I mean, when you are thinking about trying to help your low-income students climb the mountain to college, or at least some kind of post-secondary education, and I assume avoid the kind of poverty traps that we talked about earlier, early pregnancy, incarceration, et cetera, so how do you think about these issues at achievement first to get all of this balance right? How important is this stuff?
Easy questions here today. Thank you very much. Just
Oh, and do it in like 30 seconds if you can.
exactly.
Yeah.
I can't resist. I think, just on the tracking point, I think Tom is making a very provocative argument, and one I personally struggled with, and the feeling that we're not serving our top kids well enough. We do the compacting you're describing, but we just do it in high school with Algebra 2 and geometry. And I think that we have got to figure out a way to let those kids run with support. And I think that the question I have is almost purely practical about how to do what you're describing without lowering expectations for the other students. So on to the question of social emotional learning. One of the challenges of having done this now for 15 years is that we've got kids from our original middle school who've gone to and through college. And while I could tell you a great story about, looks like we're on track for a 55% college graduation rate, which for first gen kids is pretty good, there are a lot of kids who I love, who I thought were gonna make it, and are at least temporarily on the side of that mountain climb to college. And when I think about why, certainly there are some academic gaps. I mean, I have to say college science is not surprisingly, given what we did, college science has far and away been one of the kind of gatekeeping subjects for our kids, particularly to certain professions. And I feel tremendous responsibility for that and worked hard to fix it. And so while I think there were academic gaps, I think for the most part, the difference between the kids who've been successful and the kids who haven't are all this non-cognitive stuff. And I go back and forth between being overwhelmed by its complexity, back to my sort of opening framing thought. We have to both acknowledge complexity and yet say, what is the thing I'm going to act on now and really own and make excellent? And we've all seen the lists of the non-cognitive skills. We have tried ourselves to come up with a simplified list. I think we're getting there. But when you really look at it, the biggest determinant of at least academic success, and we could want a lot more for kids, I know we all do want a lot more for kids, is effort. And so how do we maximize effort? I mean, how do we get kids to really want to do it on their own? And I think the approach we took in the early days, if a child wasn't doing their homework, when I was a middle school principal, they stayed after school with me until 7, 8 o'clock at night, and I drove them home, and they sure as heck did their homework. And that was the approach. Unfortunately, that doesn't translate very well into success in college. And so we're now in this new design, one of the things we're explicitly doubling down on is actually motivation. And how do we really help kids with goal setting, with writing their own personal narratives, revising them, with having dream teams comprised with resources, giving them more kind of curated choice in what they go after, all high quality and content rich. And trying to figure out, and I would say it's still early stages for us, but how do we have kids that are not just well prepared, but are totally fired up to go after it in life? For the things that they think are important.
This is so fascinating. So I am curious. I mean, I assume your high schools are fairly traditional college prep oriented,
Yes.
right? Your goal is a traditional 4-year college for your kids. Do you tell, I mean, are there conversations? I mean, what if kids say, you know, I have an interest in something more technical in nature, or I'd like to try an apprenticeship, or I'd like to do, I mean, is that just not the right school?
No, Bob Schwartz has been working on me now for a couple years. What we try to say is we want every one of our kids to pass 2 AP exams, and I'm hoping that number goes up over time. And we want, and in some cases that's 18 months, or there's a preparation to make sure that that's possible for them. We want them all to get a college acceptance letter, and then they can choose to do something else. Overwhelmingly, our kids are choosing to go to college. 90+%, 95% are choosing to go to college. But if they chose to do something else, we would celebrate that, as long as they didn't do it because they sold themselves short, or the adults in their lives sold them short at too early of a point.
This idea about effort, that if you sort of make them do it, that doesn't actually build the motivation that they're going to need when they're on their own and independent in college. It's the same sort of thing with discipline in general. Some people said, well, if you have this very strict discipline policy, as the kids get older, there was an article about this in New Orleans lately, right? That in high school level, okay, the kids follow all these rules and they don't talk in the hallway, and you make them do all this stuff that feels so militaristic, and then they go off to a college campus, it's completely different, they're fish out of water. How do you think about that? I mean, do you do it differently at high school than you do for elementary schools?
Yeah, so I'm quickly going out of my depth. I can only tell you my lived experience. There may well be a body of research about this, but I think what's complicated about all these questions, even the effort question and the discipline question, is there is a role for habit formation. Like, when you do something one way for long enough, it can become sort of habit. And I will say, until we opened our own high schools, we were sending a lot of kids to private schools, and they actually said to us, despite my approach of just keeping kids at school, they said, your kids are really hard workers. And that was when they were in very different environments. And so I do think you can get into certain habits that become character, identity, et cetera, for students, and that's what's so complicated about it. So the militaristic critique is a tough one. I think where we are organizationally struggling is we've always been structured and had high expectations and uniforms and those kinds of things. I think at some point it tipped into high rates of suspension. And actually didn't used to be the case when we were just a handful of schools, but somewhere in the growth about 4 years ago, it started translating into more of a kind of typical discipline structure that resulted in, frankly, too many kids getting suspended. And we flipped back on that very dramatically 2 years ago and have reduced suspensions a third last year and are en route to another third this year. And that feels a heck of a lot better. I have to say, and our school cultures have improved. It's not come at the expense of sort of really focused or positive environments. And so I think when it turns punitive, it takes on a different character. It just starts to feel different. When it is truly in the spirit of love and sort of warm demanding and helping students succeed, at least we have not found sort of long-term, based on the graduates that we've had, that they have been compromised by that.
And you've reduced it, but you haven't reduced it to zero in terms of suspensions,
No.
right? I mean, it's still a tool that you use. All right, I'm sorry. I'm like, everybody on Twitter is always like, why do we listen to these education experts, Mike? We should ask a teacher. So I'm like, all right, we got an educator. Let's drill her for all this information. One last question. At Achievement First. Okay, we have talked about the success sequence. I've been trying to get this message out. Key part of it is don't have a baby until you're ready, right? Do you have that talk with the kids at Achievement First? Is that something you guys take responsibility for, having those kinds of conversations with the kids?
Yes, absolutely.
How does that go? I mean, I don't need the explicit. I mean, is it like we have a teenage pregnancy prevention program? We have sex. I mean, I'm just curious what, if the conversation is, hey, if you want these goals of yours, a baby's going to be a major challenge.
Yeah, just to be clear, we have it with the boys as well as the girls.
Yes, I assume.
And I think it's been a while since my middle school principal's days, so I'm a little rusty on my own personal conversations. But as with all things in terms of influencing kids, it has to be adults they trust, who they really believe, and kids know the real deal, care about them. And those conversations happen in a structured way in kind of advisory groups, which for certain points of the year are single gender, for other parts are not. And they happen probably far more effectively through lots of one-on-one conversations when kids are struggling with issues, and thank goodness they're surrounded by adults who they trust, and they just start talking. And you got to listen first, and then you can provide advice, hopefully delivered in a way that they're going to listen.
How have your alumni done on that score? I mean, do you see many of them having challenges with early pregnancy?
Certainly some have. I should know the exact data. Impressionistically, it seems a lot lower than it would be otherwise. It's dramatically tied to college. So there certainly are kids who've gone off to college and nevertheless still, again, either father or mother for a child. It's much less likely. It's those kids who are hanging out on the side of the mountain that are far more likely, and it's hard to know what's the chicken and egg, sorry for the pun there, or the comparison, but it's hard to know what comes first.
All right, Tom, you get the last word.
I have never studied suspension, expulsion stuff because I don't really trust the data, and so I'll just tell an anecdote why I don't trust the data. I taught 6th grade in the 1980s. I taught for about a decade. And in my school, I had 3 different principals. The first principal, we had a very orderly campus. The kids were happy. The kids loved the principal. That principal left. Another principal came in who just wasn't as forceful with the kids, frankly. But her goal was to cut our suspension rate in half, and she succeeded in doing that. In fact, she lowered it almost all the way to 0. But the environment of the school was like a reign of terror. So the suspension rate went down, but I don't know how to, the living environment it went down. It was no indication that suddenly the school was better behaved. The school was much worse behaved. And so when I look at suspension and expulsion data, what does it mean? Do I want it to go up? What's the expected value? Going up, going down? And what does it mean when it makes those moves? So take all that stuff, with some caution.
You might share that with the Office of Civil Rights, Tom, about some of the concerns about using the data in the wrong way. Hey, join me in thanking our panel. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you. Let's do a 10-minute break, then we will get started with our final panel of the day. 10-minute break. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate you.